Welcome back, All Sports West New York. Tim Graham from the Buffalo News. We're talking boxing. Tim, you mentioned about, we were just talking about how the big fights were available on television, but some of them were, but the really big fights were on closed circuit. You used to have to go to a theater to watch the fight, and they'd have a big satellite dish. And I can tell you a real quick story. My first live appearance on WBBZ-TV in 1984, I think it was, 83 or 84, the Hearns-Hagler fight was taking place. It was on a closed circuit at Shays. Then sports director Rick Azar said, "Hey, babe, you want to do a live hit tonight?" And I had yet to be on live. "Yeah, sure, Rick, whatever." I didn't care what it was. And so they set me out there hoping that maybe the fight would have started by the time sports came on at 11:20, whatever it was at the time. Because back then, Channel 7 showed sports second and weather was third. I'm really dating myself now. So they send me over there. They come to me live, and as luck would have it, they're in the national anthem. So I say to Rick, well, they're singing the national anthem, and we laugh, and, well, that's live television. We throw back to him. So then I get something in my ear. The fight had started, and if you remember Hearns-Hagler, it's like two of the greated rounds in the history of boxing.
Maybe the greatest fight, unless you want, you need
unless
to
you're
see
Tommy
12.
Hearns,
Right.
Unless you're Tommy Hearns, because he ended up getting it worse than he gave. But it was a great action fight. So they come back to me at the very end of the show, and as they just come back to me for an update, Hagler knocks out Hearns. So on live television, I says, you know, Hagler with the right, with the left. Hearns is down. He's out. It looked so staged that when I threw it back to Rick, Rick didn't know if I was pulling his leg. And Don Postles, who was the news anchor sitting next to him at the time, he was like, wow, live television. When I came back, because this was back before the days of any kind of social media or anything else, Rick was waiting for me to come back to confirm that Hagler actually won the fight. Anyway, so it was closed circuit television was the way people watched the big fights then. Now you have home, you have pay-per-view. So the money
4.4 million United States
viewers,
buyers of this pay-per-view at $100.
So the money's potentially bigger than ever before, but there's just not any stars left in the sport.
That's the thing about this fight. If it were a dud, we could just dismiss it and say, all right, the next big fight is going to be 2 or 3 months from now. It used to be there was a Mayweather-Pacquiao 3 times a year, whether it was De La Hoya, Trinidad, or any time Mike Tyson fought. Most of the time Mike Tyson fought. There were fighters out there who captured, or a young Floyd Mayweather was coming up, a Lennox Lewis. But now, the last big fight was 8 years ago, De La Hoya Mayweather. And we were talking in Las Vegas, some friends of mine, I used to work in Las Vegas for 5 years, and my former sports editor, he used to have this phrase, he was called a tent fight. If there was a media tent needed to be built to take care of the media out in the parking lot of the Caesars Palace or the Mirage or what have you, it was called a tent fight. He thought that the last tent fight in Las Vegas was Tyson Holyfield 2, which was way back. I was living there still, so that was the 90s. And so this was a tent fight. Well, what's the next tent fight for Las Vegas? And can you name 2 fighters? And that was a story I wrote for the Buffalo News heading into the fight. I was at the steps of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where Rocky infamously ran up the steps. It's an iconic place. It's a seminal boxing moment. The statue is there of Rocky with his hands above his head. These kids from Lexington, Kentucky, 2 charter buses on a field trip, 80 kids run up the steps, so they clearly know what this place is. They go pose by the statue. And I approached one of the teachers and I said, I'm Tim Graham from the Buffalo News, I'm doing a story, can I ask your class a question? Absolutely. So I said, can anybody here name the heavyweight champion of the world? 0 kids from middle America, 8th graders, that's older than the age when we got into it. The adults didn't know, the chaperones didn't know, there were some passers-by who kind of got involved in it. Nobody knew who the heavyweight champion of the world is. And this is not a trick question, because Vladimir Klitschko has been the widely accepted heavyweight champion for 9 years, the second longest reign to only Joe Louis, and people still don't know who he is. This used to be the alpha male of the sport, and so that's just indicative of where we are. There are no next big fights after this.
There's a lot of things I could talk about that I'd like to talk about. I can talk about the fact that back in the heyday when we were younger, it was the African-American boxer that dominated the sport. Before our day,
especially at heavyweight.
Right. It was the white Irish boxer, Italian boxer.
Jewish.
I mean, right. Every underclass came through, used boxing, a lot of those top boxers.
That's right.
That's how they got out of the ghetto.
It's a sport of desperation.
Right. And now you even hear boxers talk about how the great African-American athletes go to football, go to basketball, go to
Soccer
another sport.
even,
right.
Which would never happen.
And I don't blame them, because boxing
Sure.
is a brutal, brutal sport. Look.
There's a great quote that I can't repeat here on the air that Larry Holmes gave me for that story that I did. And it was essentially, why would anyone want to do this? Why would anybody want to get punched in the head? And he mentioned that his son wanted to try it. And he said, no, I took the punches. You can have my money when I'm dead. I took the punches. I don't want you taking the punches.
Okay, so, but I could talk about all that, but one thing you and I have never had a chance to talk about on air, your involvement, your place in the career of Joe Macy and where that all ended. Because if I remember correctly, you were the first to reveal the brain scan that he had a bleed after the fight in Vegas.
There were a couple others. Teddy Atlas on ESPN, I believe, was the first to, if he didn't report it, he heavily hinted at it. And maybe didn't have and then Tom Hauser, who's the Muhammad Ali's biographer, also reported it. But yeah, that was a devastating time for him and his career. And
the Macy camp pretty much denied it and wanted to keep it a secret. And you've been around boxing a long time. If that had been exposed, you think they could have pulled that off?
No, because I know who knew. Too many people in boxing already knew. And it was just a matter of the media finding out when was it ever going to get publicized. There was going to come a time, if Joe Macy wanted to fight for the heavyweight championship of the world, that he was going to need to get licensed in Nevada, because that's where the big fights have to happen. And Nevada is where that fight transpired. It was where that brain injury took place. And Nevada is a very public state. It's an open records law state. They can't even have a meeting unless they let people know and the press can come and cover it. So that's why it was unfortunate for Joe Macy that not only did it happen, but it happened in Nevada. And if it had happened in many other states, it would have been the same. But Nevada is a very...
Well, was the test taken in Nevada, or was the test taken in New York?
Well, the tests were taken in many places because the Macy camp didn't want to believe that it was true. And so they went to different doctors. But the original test took place in Buffalo. And the records then were released. And I'm not really sure how that got out.
And those results had to be sent back to the Nevada Boxing Commission.
Well, Nevada started asking for these reports, which it knew existed. And the Macy camp tried to say that it's not true, but Nevada knew what was out there.
We've only got 2 minutes, and we don't really have enough time to go too much deeper into it, but let me just ask you a question. I'm not going to ask you whether Joe Macy would have been the heavyweight champ of the world, but...
He would have been.
You think he would have been?
He would have been. There are 4 champions. There are 4 world titles that are generally accepted. Would he have been considered the heavyweight champion of the world? Probably not. But he only needed to get one crack at one of those 4 belts.
So let's put it this way. He would have put a lot of money in his pocket before it was all over with.
I think he still did. But yeah, he would have continued on HBO. I don't think that Joe Macy was ever a pay-per-view type attraction, but maybe he could have been. Maybe he starts to capture the imagination of people and start to spill over mainstream, Great White Hope, all that type of stuff. Does he fight Mike Tyson? That's a big payday. Does he fight Lennox Lewis? That would be a big one. Evander Holyfield. I mean, it depends. Those fighters were all sort of petering out at that time, which is also leading to where boxing is now. But yeah, he would have made a lot more money.
Well, if and buts were candy and nuts, we'd all have a Merry Christmas. Tim, it's great having you on the show. I love talking. I mean, we could have gone an hour. And next time we'll have you on, we'll probably have to talk about boring football or something like that. But for one night, we got to talk boxing, and it's a great sport. It's a brutal sport, but it's you get very few instances in athletics where 2 gladiators get into a ring and go at it.
That's it.
Tim, thanks for being on.
Thanks, Bob.
We'll be back to wrap up all sports WNY right after this.